Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to our taster webinar this afternoon on our workforce wellbeing workshops that we are launching here at the Well-Led Provider. Really nice to meet you all. There's some familiar names, but also some brand new names as well. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Dr. Claire Sieber. I'm the Chief Medical Officer of the Well-Led Provider, and I'm a GP by background based in West Sussex. And I will introduce you to Bernard shortly, who will be taking you through this taster workshop. And Bernard, could we do the next slide, please?
Of course, yes.
Thank you. So this taster workshop that we're doing today for the maximum an hour of your time is to talk you through the three new workshop wellbeing offerings that we're providing here at the Well-Led Practice for you and your primary care teams. We've got a workshop on how to manage stress in the moment, a workshop about building resilience and understanding more about your well-being, and then a workshop on the effect of adverse experiences and some techniques to release those experiences that you or your colleagues have suffered from. And each of those workshops is a 3-hour online workshop, which all of your staff members, clinical and non-clinical, can attend if it's something you wish to invest in your staff by providing. And this taster workshop will give you a sample of some of the content from each of those three workshops. Just a little bit of housekeeping before I hand over to Bernard. Like all of our webinars, if you've been on them before, it's being recorded, and the recording and how to access the slides will be sent to you all by email afterwards. So long as you've registered for this webinar, and there's no way you would be here unless you'd registered, you will get that by email. We have the Q&A open in the tab at the top, as well as the chat. So feel free to pop some questions in as they come to your mind, and we will try and take some time for questions at the end. If there's any major ones that we can't answer, we can always contact you afterwards individually because we've got your email addresses. So you can sit back and enjoy the webinar knowing that you'll get all of the content afterwards, and there's no need to take notes or screenshots. So let me introduce you now to Bernard, who will tell you a little bit about himself and how he came into this world, and talk you through some of the aims and objectives of today, and then get going, giving you a taster of some of the stuff that he covers in our workshops. Thanks, Bernard.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks ever so much for the warm introduction. And hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to this workshop today. If I may, I'll just very briefly go through the aims and desired outcomes for today. Then I'll introduce myself on the next slide. So the aims of today's session is to get underneath the bonnet of a subject called secondary traumatic stress. Now, many of us are aware of post-traumatic stress, but something that goes under the radar is secondary traumatic stress, and it's particularly prevalent in all frontline emergency services, including primary care. So I'm aiming to get that on the radar today, and also the topic of emotional trauma and its risk in primary care. The ideal outcomes is by the end of our 50 minutes together, you'll know some of the things that you can do in your practice to prevent, recognize, and support any staff exposed to secondary traumatic stress. I think that if I want to just try and summarize what my real aim is here today is, as I said, to put that on your radar, to also really put on the radar emotional stress and emotional well-being, because it is something that flies underneath the radar, mainly because if we have any kind of physical illness, it's seen, it's visible, but this is a little bit like electricity. We can't see it, but if you were to ever put your finger in a plug, you'd certainly feel it. So to get the best from our time together, maybe just make just a piece of paper, draw 2 lines down it in one column, the things that you'll start doing, the middle column, the things that you'll stop doing, and the third column, the things that you'll continue doing, because there'll be some things that I share with you and you think, I'm already doing that, and that's kind of a nice reassurance. I will give you some real takeaway actions at the end as well. There's going to be 3 QR codes we're actually going to share. So if you've got your phone ready, if there's any of those that you want to take a photograph of. So to contact up myself or Claire and her team afterwards, you can do that. So if I may, I'll introduce myself. And the little QR code there is to a podcast series that I do that is free. It's on Spotify. And the first series of that podcast is all about emotional well-being. So there's a lot more to back up what I'm sharing with you today. So me, I joined the Royal Navy back in 1977 as a young medic. Um, I was in the Royal Navy at the time of the Falklands War, so during and after that. And as a medic, we were dealing with people with physical injuries, but also psychological injuries. And back then, we didn't know what to do with the psychological injuries. PTSD was just becoming known, and we were kind of dishing out sleeping tablets, antidepressants, take some leave, holiday, and come back, and you'll be fine. The harsh reality was many of these guys were not fine. We were experiencing pretty horrendous outcomes in some cases. Guys taking their own life, and a statistic I heard a while back was more guys took their own life after the war than what actually got killed in it. But it got us asking a lot of questions. Why two people could be exposed to the same trauma, one recover really well, go on a trajectory of self-development, and another one turning his life to drink and drugs and going on a journey of self-defeation and just ruining their lives. What we found, however, was that those who gave attention to their personal resilience in the good times were the ones that recovered the best. And what we also found was that with emotional trauma, it had to be processed. So that I've spent my life ever since that in that field, hence the reason I'm here today to share with you this topic. So, types of trauma: emotional, physical. Physical, we are all aware of. But what about emotional? Let's just take a car accident. If the victims end up in A&E, the physical trauma is prioritized. But what about the emotional? How much attention is given to that? And then what about in primary care? PTSD, secondary traumatic stress, other psychological disorders. What are they? I would suggest they are really a disorder caused by the environment. So if you take away the trauma, there's no depression or PTSD. Now, I know that's a little bit controversial, but just roll with me just for a moment. So if, for example, a child is depressed because of a dysfunctional family environment, if you create good functioning in the family, the depression should go away. In the workforce, if a member of staff's anxiety is caused by a bully or a dysfunctional culture, if the bully is given professional feedback and an alternative way of doing things, or attention given to the culture change in the organization, then the anxiety goes away. Now, interestingly, there's also a known connection between unhealthy lifestyle factors, such as leaky gut. So if you change the diet and lifestyle, it makes sense that the depression goes away. This is just my personal view, but my personal view is that many of the chronic illnesses in the future will be understood to be caused by chronic inflammation, and that chronic inflammation's root cause will be a leaky gut, i.e., through really poor diets, the gut leaks allow toxins into the body, and that causes chronic inflammation. Now, that we do know can lead to leaky brain. So if somebody is anxious anyway, a poor lifestyle, including diet, will make it worse. Now, what am I saying here? Well, if the Russians, Al Qaeda, or anybody else who doesn't particularly like us wanted to implant a society and environment that have, and also, unfortunately, many workplace cultures upon us that was going to create an ever expanding emotional health crisis, we saved them a job and we've done it for them. So, what am I saying? If you ever suffer with your emotional well being, please don't take it personally. It's not your fault. It's the fault of a society in which we are in and type of workplaces that have evolved in recent years. I don't need to remind you of the pressures in primary care. Now, next, we're going to have a look at two distinct types of emotional trauma. So we've looked at the two types of trauma here. Next, we're going to look at the two types of emotional trauma. Now, as we look at this, please pay attention to the small t's, which I'll be coming on to in a moment. These are a lot more obvious, the big T traumas, and I don't need to go into these in any real depth. Because what is the big risk to us is these, the little t traumas. And this is, I'll put them up: waiting room collapses, emergencies. So I'm hoping that you can relate to some of these. Verbal assaults, seeing visibly sick patients, including children, witnessing bullying between colleagues, visible representation of massive workloads. So your screen showing the number of calls in the queue, tasks to respond to, compliance visits by CQC, and admin staff having to triage the fear of making the wrong decision. And this is not just in primary care, of course, but this is something that's prevalent across all workplaces, a lack of support from leaders. And these small t's are the big risk. And a good starting point is naming them as traumatic rather than denying them, and validating them, because that certainly aids recovery. So that is a delicate conversation, really, for leaders to have with staff, as there's a balance between being supportive, compassionate, and of course, keeping it in perspective. Now, a person may withstand a big T trauma, but be so weakened by it that it's a small t or a series of small t traumas that causes their coping abilities to collapse. And to exacerbate what we experience in life and work in recent years, of course, we've experienced the mass trauma of the COVID pandemic. Then there's been these humanitarian crises in Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, Palestine, amongst others, and then more recently, Ukraine. And for many of us, it's traumatic to watch these things on our TV screens and social media, or even reading news articles. Modern technology has been great, but it can bring disturbing images into our homes at just a click of a button. And one thing we should understand is why we get drawn into it. Now, if we were driving down the motorway together and there was an accident on the other carriage, I would suggest nearly all of us sat in that car would look at it. But why? Why do we look at it? Because we could potentially see something really disturbing. Well, the way our brains are wired, we look at it because although it's traumatic and horrible for the poor people involved in that accident, do you know what? It's not actually happening to me. So it's a temporary relief. And that's why we get drawn to these things. But in the long term, it rewires our brains in a negative way. So, what am I saying here? Please be active and not passive with what you watch, what you listen to, what you read, and even who you associate with. We need to proactively bring more positivity into our lives. With the small t's, traumas here, it's our bodies that keep the score. Now, after this webinar, if any of you are interested and you want to stay on for 10 minutes at the end, I've got a video that is 8 minutes long. It's created by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, and he's a leading trauma psychiatrist and author of a book called Body Keeps the Score. And in primary care, it's the small t's that can creep up on us. And the trauma is really our relationship with the event or the series of events, and our level of physical and psychological tolerance. So if the workplace prioritizes staff well-being, resilience and resolve, and building resilience into the teams and the workplace culture, now the individual and collective window of tolerance increases. Now, there's many different ways of describing what trauma is, but one way is to just remember the acronym, and you may want to write this down: UDIN, UDIN. So trauma can occur through an unexpected event. That's the U. That is D, dramatic. So it's got high emotion and maybe fear associated with it. It's I, isolating. We feel lonely, even though we might be surrounded by others experiencing the same thing, and we perceive we have N, no resources to deal with it. But as mentioned a moment ago, one hugely valuable resource is taking control of how we respond to it. If we think about this, we can't necessarily control unexpected events, but with knowledge of prevention and diffusing conflict and practicing assertive communication, we can make it less dramatic. And with a supportive culture, staff will not feel isolated and they will use the resources available. And there's one resource that I encourage you to take away from today: to responding rather than reacting. And that is using this analogy, stop. And this is what it means. And this is why it's so powerful. It means S, stop. T, think. O, observe. And P, plan. And the reason that is so powerful is it encourages us to temporarily stop. It encourages us to think, which is engaging our brain. It encourages us to observe the situation and observe how we are feeling about it. That is connecting with the emotive side of that event. And then we can plan. Plan to move forward, thinking differently, feeling differently about it, and we can plan to continue to move forward in a coherent state rather than an incoherent state. And I'll come back to that in a moment because there's been some fascinating research done on that topic. So there's two types of emotions that get trapped in our body. Repressed emotions, they refer to ones that we unconsciously avoid because our bodies kind of know that they are uncomfortable. And they differ from suppressed emotions, which are feelings we purposely keep down because we don't know exactly how to deal with them, or we know that they will be uncomfortable to face. And this getting trapped in our bodies is what causes the danger. So I'll just let you read the slide there just for a second while I slurp my water. So just for a moment, just reflect on how many indirect exposures to other people's traumatic events you and your colleagues have had in your careers. Have you ever considered this and ever thought that these little t traumas need to be released? Now, worryingly, many people don't even think about releasing the big T traumas either, and they carry them with them. And if they do that, it will inevitably cause them issues or problems in their life, even physical problems. Now, just one example I'll share with you here today. Many of you, I guess, will remember, especially if you're a similar age to me, the Superman actor Christopher Reeve. He had a horrific horse riding accident and he was paralyzed as a result of it, and he died, unfortunately. Now, his wife, Dana, was absolutely grief stricken by his passing. And almost 2 years to the date after he passed away, she died of lung cancer. As far as we know, never smoked in her life. As far as we know, never succumbed to secondary smoking. But what we do know, and we'll see this with Curlane photography in a moment, is that the trapped emotion of grief gets trapped in our chest area and lungs. Now, did that cause her cancer? Who knows? Who knows? But there's an awful lot of research around now that suggests that trapped emotions left in the body do cause physical illnesses. So secondary traumatic stress is a big issue. Again, I'll just let you read the slide here as I ask you once again just the same question as previously. How many indirect exposures to any other people's traumatic events have you and your colleagues had in your career? And of course, in pursuit of the sort of jobs we're doing and caring for others, do we ever neglect ourselves and our own well-being? I think sometimes we do. The very personalities of people who come into our industry, they are caring. They want to make a difference. And with that, very often becomes a personality that wants to say yes all the time. We're not terribly good at creating boundaries for ourselves and being assertive. Now, if you've ever experienced bouts of compassion fatigue, that is a sure sign. Now, as a leader in the workplace, I think we all have a duty for staff well-being and also to recognize the early warning signs of this secondary traumatic stress. and also the accumulation of these small t traumas. So, the things I would suggest that you kind of look out for in your staff and in yourself, of course, is any emotional dysregulation. So, heightened reactivity, see people becoming more reactive, mood swings, difficulty managing stress. These emotional dysregulations may manifest as anxiety, depression, or even anger issues. And of course, it's going to impact relationships and daily functioning. So look out for these sorts of things happening. Secondly, an eroded sense of self-worth, self-confidence, self-esteem. These little T traumas can cultivate deep-seated feelings of inadequacy, even shame and unworthiness, hindering our ability to assert those boundaries and make good choices. Now, the cumulative impact of these little T traumas can foster hypervigilance. That's a heightened anxiety and a pervasive sense of threat in everyday situations. So you notice that your staff are unduly anxious about coming into work and what might happen. So they could struggle with intrusive thoughts. And you're noticing staff that are tired because their sleep is disturbed, and a persistent feeling of unease or impending danger. And that's stemming from past experiences of trauma. So, if, for example, in the past, an aggressive patient relative burst through the door and verbally or physically attacked a member of staff, every time that door goes, the member of staff could get anxious and go into that hypervigilance. Then there's maladaptive coping mechanisms such as substance abuse, self-harm, or eating disorders. And these are just a means of managing those overwhelming emotions or numbing painful experiences. So those behaviors, well, initially they are perceived to serve as coping strategies. They can perpetuate cycles of self-destructive patterns and further exacerbate all kinds of mental health challenges. Now, of course, to really recognize this, we need that open, supportive culture and professional and regular one-to-ones with our staff where we can ask well-prepared questions. We can practice empathic listening and demonstrate support. Now, there's something in the services that was developed by the Royal Marines called TRIM, and that is Trauma Release Management. And it's now widely used amongst the Royal Navy, the Army, the emergency services in the UK. Some of you may have heard of it. And it's used as a form of post-incident management in order to assess the appropriate support that may be needed to be put in place for individuals following a traumatic event. The key message here is encourage your people to talk about it, have those debriefings. So let's move on to emotional well-being. Now, if you look at what we have in front of us here, again, going back to societal factors, how much of this is natural in our society? Do our politicians, do our society, do our media, do our capitalist values encourage this, encourage all this? What about our working cultures? A useful definition of emotional well-being is offered by the Mental Health Foundation, and it says a positive sense of well-being which enables an individual to be able to function in society and meet the demands of everyday life. And this is, of course, what we want for our staff. Emotional health is an important part of overall health. People who are emotionally healthy are in control of their thoughts, their feelings, and also their behaviors, and able to cope with life's challenges. They can keep problems in perspective and also bounce back from any kind of setbacks. This is what is known as emotional intelligence. Now, I would suggest in a safety critical industry like the NHS, emotionally healthy staff is really important. And as we'll see in a moment when we look briefly at the valence theory. Now, unfortunately, as I kind of suggested, trauma pervades our culture and our society. What is important to us here today is where we sit on that trauma spectrum. And it's not necessarily what happens to us, it's what's inside us and our current levels of physical, psychological, and emotional resilience that determines where we sit on that spectrum. Now, many studies show that trauma increases our risk for anxiety and depression in one study I read by an astounding 400% and can even lead to a 20-year reduction in lifespan. I'm not saying this to scare you. I am saying it because I firmly want us to put this important subject on our radar. And I encourage you to kind of look into this for yourself after our time together. Now, all traumatic events are stressful, but not all stressful events are traumatic. And that again comes down to our resilience in those three key areas. But what we know is that trauma alienates us from the present and our true reality. So we distract ourselves in meaningless conversations, gadgets, um, computer games, endless mind numbing TV, social media, and we lose awareness of the moment and we become disassociated from living, let alone living a fulfilled and purposeful life. I do think this alienation from the present and reality indicates the level of societal trauma because these distractions are so widespread. Now, in my town, I know one 60-year-old gentleman who I was talking to just the other day, who always seems to be emotionally regulated. And he always makes a point of telling me, Bernard, I've never had a TV. I've never been distracted by these things. So, what am I saying here? I think we need to face our traumas directly without any denial, without any over exaggerated sense of pain, because that opens up the doorway to health and wellness. So, I'm sure you're aware of fight or flight. It's what we were. It's what's in part of our DNA. It was passed down from our ancestors, and it came from when we were in the wild, like the animals here. Now, our brains are different to the brains of animals. You know, you got the antelope here, or the chased animal, can't think of the right word, but you know what I mean. And that animal instinctively flights, it's running for its life. We don't necessarily do that because we will react in the same way to a perceived threat because we got parts of our brain, and I don't want to get too technical with this, but the hippocampus part of our brain is where we store memories. Then we got the prefrontal cortex, and that's where in the NHS we need to operate because it's responsible for our executive functioning, making good decisions, performing in a good way. And then we got the amygdala, which is responsible for this fight or flight. What happens in the animal kingdom, it sees a threat, it goes, the amygdala straight away clicks into action and it flights, it runs away. But what we've got is this hippocampus where it stores memories. And what happens is we get somebody who shouts at us, somebody who is in our face. And the hippocampus, which stores the memories, it says, oh, danger, danger, sends a message to the amygdala, and we go into fight or flight. And those two kind of gang up on the prefrontal cortex, and we find that we can't operate in a professional way. We kind of lose it. Now, could you ever imagine this happening? Could you ever imagine an antelope seeking revenge on a lion? Of course not. So the question is, why do we get revengeful? Why do we seek retribution? Why do we get angry? Now, usually the other person is expressing their anger or frustration because that coping mechanism is lodged in their nervous system, perhaps because of what they saw or experienced as a coping mechanism as a child. Now, in one of the follow-up masterclasses, we talk in depth about the adverse childhood experiences and how they affect us as adults. But what we can learn from animals with regards to releasing their stress is three things. If you ever see an antelope or a chased animal that's escaped, it does three things. And these are three things that we can learn. The first thing it does is it stands there and shakes. And what it's doing is it's shaking that stress out of its nervous system. It's also shaking itself from what is called the sympathetic part of its nervous system. Think of sympathetic begins with S, that's its stress response, into the parasympathetic part of its nervous system. Think of para begins with para is parachute. What does that do? It slows us down. So it instinctively knows it needs to shake that stress out of its body. It needs to shake its nervous system back into the parasympathetic side. The next thing that the animal will do is it will look for the healthiest food that it can get its teeth into because it knows it needs to build up its physical strength for the next time it's chased. And the third thing it does is it goes back to the herd. Safety in numbers, but it knows that interaction with those other animals helps to build up its psychological strength for the next time. I would suggest that us humans often don't do this. Do we shake that stress out? No, we often hold it in. Do we eat the healthiest foods when we are stressed out? Comfort foods, bottle of wine in the evening, perhaps not to be recommended. And do we go and talk about it? Do we get back to the herd? No, we often isolate ourselves. We often keep it in and we don't talk to other people. So I would suggest that unless we are living in an indigenous tribe where they instinctively know how to process trauma without any drugs, and they do it by accepting support. They do it by holding ceremonies. And I'm not suggesting we all do this, but it's something we can reflect on. They do chanting. They use medicines from their land. They use sweat lodges. And they take a much more spiritual approach. And even making the individual who was the victim of that traumatic event, they make them a hero and not a victim. Now, in the Western world, we tend to seek more left brain, often pharmaceutical orientated solutions, but we don't seem to get the same results. Think of what the word emotion means: energy in motion. So we all experience sadness from time to time. If we don't allow that sadness or process that sadness through, it becomes depression because it's not shifted. Now, animals and indigenous cultures instinctively know this. So they get to work on releasing this trauma straight away. And that is what we need to do with it. And a great starting point is if you see a staff with an overexcited stress response, anger, then suggest meditation. If it's an underexcited stress response, withdrawing, gym, running, that sort of thing, reignite the nervous system. Also, incidentally, in these indigenous cultures, they do not let a stressed person near a pregnant woman because they know that their stress can be passed on to the infant. So let's explore very briefly here the responses and then the behaviors associated with them so we can be aware of them in our workplaces. Fight. This is kind of self-preservation, explosive temper, not listening to other people, being controlling, even bullying, demanding, dictatorial with a sense of entitlement. Then we've got flight. This is over worrying. That's high energy by rushing around, being a workaholic, micromanaging, and being an overachiever. So we just can't relax. Then we've got the freeze. This is where you notice the staff that are spaced out. They're hibernating, pushing themselves away. They've got brain fog, perhaps, and they're being very indecisive. When we freeze, we can become disassociated from ourselves and the world around us. So, for example, you may feel detached from your body or even feel as though the world around you is unreal. What's happening is your energy system is highly activated and it doesn't discharge this, and it results in emotional trauma. When this freeze happens, the prefrontal part of your brain, which I talked about, doesn't work. So this trauma must be released. And then on the bottom right here, we've got fawn. This is where we are scared to speak up, where we are just flatter at other people. We're being overcaring, not standing up for ourselves. So we are easily exploited. We want acceptance, so we become a yes man or a yes lady. Now, we all have a preferred response, but the question is, what is each of ours? Now, what about your staff? Now, the trauma cycle tends to be we go into fight or flight and then freeze or fawn. Now, I've noticed in my local community, and this is backed up by many research studies, many people who I've seen who've got chronic illnesses. I've got a friend who got dementia. That was preceded by a nasty car accident some months before. And previous to that, he had a really healthy lifestyle. He was a runner. He ate a very healthy diet. I've seen a couple of people who've got Parkinson's disease. One of them in particular was exposed to 3 bouts of trauma before he got it. One was a trauma on himself where he was hit by a car. Another one was where he found his father in the bathroom who had unfortunately died. And the third one was where his son was involved in a nasty accident himself. So, with something like emotions, we can't see it. As I said, unlike physical illness or injury. So, the last thing I want to do today is just to look at trying to make this real by looking at a few pictorial representations of emotions. And the first one here, this is, if we look at the picture here, and if we look at happiness, and if we look at depression, we can see that in the depression, it's got a lot of blue. Think winter blues, and that's of course what we should avoid. Now, Curlane photography, which is what this is, it depicts an energy field or an aura, and it reflects the physical and emotional state of the subject. So anger has yellow because it's a survival reaction. So prolonged anger and aggression, however, leads to sadness and depression. Now, if any of you would ever like to see energy, one way you can do this is, we're in summer months now, so it's an ideal time to do it. If you were to lay on your lawn or a field, and if you were just, don't look into the sun, but just focus your eyes about 6 inches in front of you, and just allow yourself to relax and focus your eyes 6 inches in front of you. And after a while, you'll see little white dots buzzing around in front of you. That's the energy field around you. And then if you were to look at a tree and focus on perhaps the leaves, you'll see a little white filled around all the trees. And that's the aura. When I first was introduced to all this stuff, I needed a little bit of evidence. I needed proof. So the person I was talking to did that with me, and it made it real. So if you're a little bit skeptical, like I have been in my past, then that's not a bad exercise to do. So what are we looking at here? Well, when we react to others through anger, we operate at a much lower frequency than if we choose to respond through enlightenment. That's that word, choose to respond. That's stop, think, observe, and plan. When we operate through a low frequency, that low frequency vibration transfers to others, even if we're not aware of it. We've all probably experienced this negative energy where you walk into a room where people have perhaps been arguing, and you can just pick up on the vibe. Now, every time we resist the desire to react or say something negative, our vibrational energy increases, as does our self control, confidence, and self assurance, especially when you can stop and focus on the opposite positive emotion. Now, I'm talking about things here, I go into it in a lot more depth than the follow up sessions that we provide. And if we look at to the right of the picture here, our consciousness expands. Energy goes where energy flows. So, what does this mean? Let's surround ourselves with energy that elevates us. In this picture, this is the Hertz vibration scale, and every cell in our body is affected by the emotional vibrational frequency that we manifest. Emotions have voltage. The higher the frequency, then the higher the expansion, and the greater the life force in our cells. The lower the vibrational frequency, then the greater the contraction and the lesser the life force in our cells. What does this mean? We have lower energy, we have fatigue, we take if we take anger, for example, our thoughts begin it, our emotions amplify it, our physiology, biology changes it, raised blood pressure, for example, and our action increases its momentum. So it's really important to take control of negative emotions and proactively bring more positive emotions into our life. Because when we're vibrating at this higher level, we feel lighter, happier, and more at ease. Whereas the lower vibration, we feel heavy, dark, and confused. And also, the higher your vibration, the lower your stress levels. Now, if you take a look at the top of this slide, an interesting challenge is how to bring these into the workplace and enlightenment. Now, it's recognized that the 7 elements of an enlightened workplace are safety, your staff feel safe; care, they feel that they're cared for; respect, we all treat each other with respect. So, for example, we practice egoless leadership; joy, we bring some fun and joy into the workplace; progress, we feel that we are progressing; value, perhaps we have shared values; and meaning, there's a sense of meaning to what we do. How many times in healthcare do we take for granted what we're doing and don't attach meaning to it? So, what's this? Now, these are images of how water crystallizes differently depending on what it's exposed to. Now, we humans are somewhere between 60 and 75% water. I'm not sure the exact amount, it's somewhere like that. So, what impact does positive words and images have on us? I believe a great deal. And it's kind of, we can see that water crystallizes differently here. So, what impact does it have on us? Let me just give you an example of the impact that words have. There were two children in a tree and two parents beneath. And a big gush of wind comes across. The first parent looks up and says, Jane, don't fall. What does Jane do? She focuses on falling and falls out of the tree. The other parent looks up and says, Sarah, hold on tightly. What does Sarah do? Hold on tightly. Now, you're all leaders here. What does this mean to us? Think carefully about the words that you use. Talk to your staff about what you want, not what you don't want, because that's what they'll focus on. Now, what we see here, this is a Japanese businessman, Emoto, and he was an author who claimed that human consciousness could affect the molecular structure of water. And he wrote his theories in a book, but he did a YouTube clip which I found more interesting. It's called Dr. Masuru's, as Masuru, Emoto's, Emotos, rice and water experiment, and it shows how our thoughts and words create our reality. If you want, I can, at the end, if somebody reminds me, I've got the link here, I can just pop it in the chat box. Okay, what are we going to just talk about now? Now, debilitating emotions such as anger raises our brain waves by over 200 times the norm. It's no wonder we can't think and act rationally when we're in that fight or flight. And as I've suggested, it's absolutely vital in a safety critical industry like primary care that we are able to go away from that fight or flight, that we're able to initiate that stop command. Now, at the top here, this is frustration. And you can see where the circles come in here, that there's a real disconnect between the heart and brain. And this leads to something called incoherence. Now, the links on the bottom here, this is HeartMath, who are the pioneers of this stuff. And if any of you are looking for the science behind this, please go into their website. These people really do specialize in it. But HeartMath, they are at the forefront of this research, and this is what they say about the heart-brain connection. I'm just going to read a little bit from their website. Most of us have been taught at school that the heart is constantly responding to orders sent by the brain in the form of neurosignals. However, it's not as commonly known that the heart actually sends more signals to the brain than the brain sends to the heart. Moreover, these heart signals have a significant effect on brain function, influencing emotional processing as well as a higher cognitive faculties such as attention, perception, memory, and problem solving. In other words, not only does the heart respond to the brain, but the brain continuously responds to the heart. The effect of heart activity on brain functions has been researched extensively over the past 40 years. Earlier research mainly examined the effects of heart activity occurring on a very short time scale, over several heartbeats at a max. Now, the scientists here at HeartMath, they extended that research by looking at how larger scale patterns of heart activity affect the brain's functioning. The key question for us, I believe, is how do we create more coherence? And I'm just going to give you a couple to take away from today. The first one is, because we're talking about coherence here between heart and mind. Put your right hand on your heart, if you can see me now. We take deep breaths, always in and out through your nose. Just take 5 to 10 deep breaths in and out through your nose, and moving your attention inwards. And immediately what you're doing is you are creating more coherence. I'll put this as one of the actions at the end: a positive emotion of the week and day. Build reflection time into your calendar, some time every day, every week, where you can just reflect and ask yourself, what's most important for me today? Really important, internalize that stop command and teach it to your staff. So it's stop, think, observe, plan. And my key message here really is that when we need coherence the most, that's in those highly charged times. That's when our body naturally reacts in the opposite way. So we need to proactively practice coherence so we can call on it when we need it. Incoherence not addressed leads to chronic stress and chronic illness. So learn to calm the mind and body when we need to. Now, hopefully here, with Curlane photography, Hertz vibrational frequency, seeing the impact of crystallizing water and incoherence here between our heart and minds, hopefully that makes the subject of emotions and chronic stress trauma real, and it puts it firmly on our radar. Just before I wrap up, how does this impact our performance in the workplace? Well, this is something called the valence theory. And emotional valence describes the extent to which an emotion is positive or negative, whereas arousal refers to its intensity, the strength of the associated emotional state. The key message here is when you are in a high arousal negative valence state, it will impact your performance, your decision making, ability to respond to the world. So, as a true professional, we need to create that positive working culture I've mentioned a few times. And one of the actions I encourage you to take is from today, as I said a couple of times, is to teach your staff that stop command. It's something I teach to colleagues via Health Education England. And when I'm working with surgeons, I say to them, for example, if you're in uh, the operating theatre and things are not going well, if you've trained all your staff on the stop command and things, because if one person is stressed in that environment, that stress passes on to other people. Teach all of your staff to stop command. It doesn't mean we physically stop, we just mentally stop. So if somebody issues a stop command because they can see that everybody is stressed and temporarily everybody just stops thinking, stops what they're doing in their mind. They think about it. They're engaging the brain once again. They're observing what's happening. They're observing how they are feeling, and they are planning to move forward in a coherent state. So they just briefly calm themselves down and then move forward. So please take that stop command. If any of you are really interested, look up the work of Dr. Robin Youngston. He's talked about the importance of compassion in healthcare, and he brings together evidence from neuroscience and clinical trials, which indicates that compassion is not only right in healthcare, but also really cost effective. He also argues from a neuroscientific evidence that NHS staff who show compassion cope better and burn out less. You know, on the follow-up, one of the follow-up masterclasses, I guide you through what we call the 6 R's of emotional regulation. They are relate, resources, reprogramming, repatterning, reflecting, and resilience. But please take from today the first one, which is relate, as I cover all the others on the follow-up sessions. Now, psychologists and emotional mental health professionals, they talk about the importance of having strong social support network. Researchers also demonstrated the link between social relationships and many different aspects of health and wellness, and it's classed as one of the most important aspects with secondary traumatic stress and PTSD. None of us know when we can suffer from this. It can happen to any of us anytime. So what are my key messages here today? Stop, think, observe, plan. And as I said, I encourage you to teach this to all your staff and empower them to use it when needed. What you're doing there is you are developing leaders. Build a foundation culture. That's the first of those 6 R's I mentioned. Relate by building cultural resilience, supportive culture, openness. We cooperate, we work together as a team. Everybody in a leadership position practices egoless leadership. Create a staff code of conduct, and also maybe bring in those 7 strategies of an enlightened culture, namely safety, care, respect, joy, progress, value, and meaning. And I would also just add to that as well that because, as I briefly mentioned early on, a diet laden with processed food can cause that leaky gut, and a leaky gut allows chemicals from that food into the bloodstream, then to the brain, which causes leaky brain, and it can exacerbate emotional issues. And in just last month, no, is what we're in now, Junior. Last month, I read a study that suggested lots of sugary food causes brain dysfunction and a warning sign for dementia. So you may also want to consider, if you have snacks for your staff, fruit type snacks rather than the processed food type. Secondly, start every week with a positive emotion of the week. Start your Monday morning in surgery, perhaps with this. Our positive emotion this week is kindness, or it can be compassion, support, caring. Engage with your staff; they will come up with them as well. And encourage your staff to start each day at home with that positive emotion of the day. I always say to people, the first step out of bed, make that an intent. The intent today is to make today a great day. When they clean their teeth, we all practice dental hygiene, practice emotional hygiene with that positive emotion of the day. Have it written on a post-it note, stick it on your bathroom mirror, perhaps. Fourthly, encourage all of your staff to read, watch, listen to, and associate with uplifting material and people. It helps to balance all the negativity in our society. It helps to bring greater coherence into our life. And of course, practice emotional awareness. Set that little reminder on your phone to reflect 2 or 3 times at least every day, and just what am I experiencing? How are my emotions today? What emotions am I experiencing? If you can begin to name the emotions you're experiencing, you are really practicing emotional awareness and emotional intelligence. And trauma debriefing. If any of your staff are exposed to an angry patient, an angry relative, and they could be impacted by that, have a trauma debriefing, even if it's on a one-to-one. If it's something that impacts several staff, get together, have a trauma debriefing with them. So, what next? How to manage stress in the moment, building resilience through understanding physical and psychological well-being, the effects of well, not just adverse childhood experiences, but adverse experiences, and techniques to track, trace, and release these. These are the three-hour follow-up masterclasses that we've designed. We've also can do some staff well-being programs, or like a group coaching. So, if you identified one key person from your practice that wanted to come on this, it's a very cost-effective way of doing it. It can help give you CQC evidence. It's, of course, going to build staff resilience and reduce turnover and stress. And it can be benchmarked. So, for example, I've got what's called a well-being wheel of life, and you can ask all of your staff to score that in 8 key areas now of their well-being. You can implement the program, score it again at the end, and if you've seen all the scores increase, it means your staff well-being program is working. If you're interested in this, please email Claire and her colleagues at the end. If we got enough people that are interested, we'll put together the program for you. My last thing, just a little request, really. Based on what we've talked about today, I do an annual retreat at a place in Spain for veterans, for serving or retired police or other frontline service personnel who may be impacted with post-traumatic stress or secondary traumatic stress. And the barcode there takes us straight to the details of that retreat. Some additional resources that you may want to have a look at. And finally, then we've got Claire's details and the QR code. So that's the third QR code that I mentioned. And that's the end of the input from me. I'm just going to check my time. Looks like we're just about on time. If any of you if there's any questions that come in the chat box, we can address them. And if anyone wants to stay at the end and watch that video that I mentioned, I'm really happy to do that as well. So I've just taken the slides down for a moment and see if there's any questions, Claire.
Thank you, Bernard. Nothing in the chat or Q&A so far, but I'll give everybody a moment just in case they've got anything that they want to put to you. And just to remind you all that you'll get an email afterwards with the slides and the recording and some and how to subscribe if you'd like to be part of these workshops in the future, or if you're interested in the group coaching that Bernard refers to, if you want to get your staff wellbeing champions onto that. So you'll get that email anyway. And what I could do, Bernard, is I could put the link to the video in the email as well, so people can watch it in their own time.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Doesn't look like we've got any questions. So, oh, hold on. What's this in the chat? Can I have the email address, Claire? Mantra, is that my email address? I'm assuming it is. I'll put my email address in the chat. But you'll be getting information from us anyway afterwards. That's my email address going in there. Lovely. Well, you can have 5 minutes back of your lunchtime, or you're welcome to stay on, like Bernard said, if you would like to watch the video live. I can send you a link to it anyway afterwards. And thank you very much for tuning in, everybody. It was really thought-provoking and insightful stuff. I love the gazelle thing and being able to shake off, go and eat some nutritious food, and then spend some time with your peers and loved ones. And exactly the opposite of what I do when I'm under stress. Like you say, I bottle it up, go and open a bottle, and sit in a dark room and go to bed early. So I need to work on that myself, don't I?
Yeah, you're not the only one, if it's any consolation. I saw a couple of things come in the chat box. Was there anything for me to?
I think it's just thank yous. That was brilliant. Thank you. That was so inspiring. Lessons learned. That's some lovely feedback. Thank you for filling it in, everybody. Let's end the webinar, shall we?